Let us pray. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. What's the difference between, or what's the difference or line between being affirmed, confirmed of your value, worth, and importance on the one hand, and becoming self-important on the other? Let me repeat. What's the difference between being affirmed and confirmed of who you are, what you do, and your value, your intrinsic values on the one hand, and becoming self-important? And if you have power and influence to wield on it, you will use it to intensify their self-importance. Today we have two stories. First one is Elijah handing over the mantle to Elisha. The reading today ends when Elijah goes up, but right after the scene when Elisha tore the clothes off, the mantle that Elijah was wearing comes down from heaven, and it becomes Elisha's mantle. So that's why we have this expression of passing the mantle as a generation changes and new leadership comes up, right? This is the origin story for that. So let's talk a little bit about Elijah, about self-importance. And Elijah was a great prophet. He did enormous things. He did a lot of miraculous stuff. But when his life was, excuse me, when his life was threatened, he runs away. And after a while, God confronts him, and Elijah had this self-pity, self-importance moment, declaring that nobody is following you anymore. I'm the only one left. Of course, that's not the case. God lovingly and firmly confronts Elijah, saying, well, I've reserved 7,000 prophets who have not bowed to the false idols yet, that you may not be aware of. This is what you do. You go and anoint this king. And one of the things you got to do is anoint Elisha and train him, apprentice him, because he's the one who will continue your ministry after your day is over. And today's reading was that moment when Elijah's work was completed, and he was such a great, great prophet. He didn't die typical death. He was taken up in fiery chariot to heaven. It's an important story. No matter how great Elijah was, and Elijah knew how important he was in God's ministry, and he had all the respect and authority as prophet, he may have wielded all those things, right? He still was only one servant of God among many. In the series of successions in fulfilling God's redemptive work in this world. And when Elijah knows it, and that his life of great ability and achievement to fully serve God's purpose, and knowing he's only one of many servants in successions fulfilling God's work, when you see himself as part of this long, glorious succession for God's redemptive work, it helps him to focus not on himself. He shields himself from resorting or falling into self-importance. And at that moment, he becomes the greatest that he could ever be. Without any detachment, he's able to hand over the mantle to the next person in succession that God has chosen and called. And there are many, many other disciples and servants of God that I'm not aware of. You're not aware of. it looks like we are the only one doing God's work. No, God is doing God's work all over the world or throughout the creation, right? Elijah knew that and fulfilled it so humbly till the last moment and handed that spirit of humility, double the dosage to Elisha because that's how much Elisha wanted to be part of that succession. Let's go to transfiguration story. Um, It begins with 6 days after Jesus took Peter, James, and John and went up a mountain. 6 days after. What happened 6 days previous to this reporting? 6 days before is when Peter confessed that this Jesus of Nazareth that he has been following is the Christ, the Son of God. So Jesus finally came to that point where people around him can see and call him Christ. As soon as that happens, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John to the mountain away from everyone else. It is somewhat like the self-isolation Jesus does regularly before every major challenge and task, as I preached last Sunday. But this time around, it's interesting that Jesus takes his three of top disciples uh, almost as if he needs to apprentice them, similar to the way Elijah did with Elisha. I repeat, Jesus was just affirmed in a major way. The cumulative track records of Jesus' ministry became so convincing enough for his disciples to recognize that he is the Christ. Now, when you are affirmed and confirmed in a major way, it is very important that you let yourself to be validated, yes. But at the same time, however, you have to make sure that you do not become self-important as a result. To prevent it, you need to go through intentional self-introspection. Earlier, much earlier, when Jesus was baptized and had the heavenly confirmation that he is the beloved Son of God, with whom God is well pleased. Well, immediately after that, Jesus goes out into the wilderness and be tempted, meaning checking on all the temptations that may come when this validation becomes self-importance. To make sure that he overcomes this temptation to become self-important. If you remember the temptation, it begins with, so if you are the Son of God, can you make this stone to become a bread? So if you are the Son of God, can you fall down from the pinnacle and still not get hurt? Do you hear it goes? Jesus confronts it and overcomes it. Here, when Jesus goes up to the mountaintop with 3 disciples, it was also making his mission and ministry as Christ to be fulfilled and what it ought to be, and not caught up in the fact that he is the Christ. Do you hear the subtle difference? You know, on that mountaintop, Jesus is having conversation with Moses and Elijah concerning how Jesus would be completing his life on earth. This part comes from other gospels, right? Mark doesn't talk about the content, but other synoptic gospels say he was having conversation regarding how he's going to complete his life on earth, right? By dying on the cross. A lot of symbolism here. Moses representing the law, Elijah representing the prophets. The law and the prophets was how Jewish people at the time referred to the Bible. At the time of Jesus, the first 5 books of Moses and the prophetic writings were already canonized and were considered to be the Bible. That's why when Jesus says, love God and love your neighbor, this fulfills the laws and the prophets. He was actually saying, when you love God with all your hearts and minds, love your neighbor as yourselves, you fulfill the entirety of the Bible. That's what Jesus was saying. The third part, the writing, such as wisdom literature, were not yet canonized. It had to wait until AD 90, right? About 60 years later, than this moment when Jesus went up to the mountain. Looked at from a slightly different angle, when Jesus goes up to the mountain, have a conversation with Moses and Elijah, Jesus is actually putting his ministry as part of this long, great, and grand succession of God's chosen leaders and spokespersons in God's redemptive history. Jesus knew that he did not come into the scene in vacuum, but as a critical link. For us, it's actually the critical link in great and the greatest succession of God's people doing God's work and becoming God's spokesperson and agents for the redemption of the world. Three disciples were enchanted. They were experiencing this supernatural, miraculous things and got confused that perhaps this was the reason of their religious, spiritual, and ministerial missional journey with Jesus. They wanted to stay up there. The privilege that comes with being part of Jesus' inner circle, having a personal connection with Jesus, is this kind of great religious experience. You converse with the celestial leaders, right? And they do hear the voice of God, which parallels what Jesus heard at his baptism with a slight twist. This is what they hear. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Listen to him. What Jesus tells the disciple is what needs to be done. Look, you're not supposed to stay up here. You may need this kind of high religious experiences for confirmation and validations. But that's not the purpose. It shouldn't lead you to self-importance and just staying up here in this glory. Let's go down the mountain to the valleys where people suffer, need to hear the gospel of good news proclaimed to them, and continue to care for the people. And after his resurrection, he would commission his disciples to the entire world to make disciples, so that the great redemptive work of God that was brought in and through Jesus Christ will continue and become realized in all the details of our concrete lives throughout the world, throughout history. Remember, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that succession, Jesus saw himself as part of the great prophets and in history before Jesus, and he becoming the critical link of this succession, handing over the mantle to Peter, James, and John, and to all the disciples, and we, the church, as the legacy of that apostolic succession. And when you see yourself that way, you are part of a succession, you are validated, affirmed of great work of God's salvation for all humanities, beginning with you. But you also know that you are only one of God's servants and God's children who are doing the God's work in succession. You always come into this world and to a certain ministry because people before you have been called by God, and you are called to pick up the mantle. I mean, you can look at the Morningside UMC. You know, I was one of the earlier pastors. Many pastors, before I came back to last year, I do my ministry upon their shoulders, their ministries. And after, I don't know how long I'll be here with you, but after me will be a succession of pastors. It's not just pastors. The lay people, the only person that was there from the beginning that still is with us is Paul, right? Many people came and have gone, but many people are also called by God to join and continue the ministry. What matters is the ministry of God in and through Morningside continues until its natural lifespan, according to God's book of life, is completed. Your professional life, same thing. There are specific witnesses and work to be done, not necessarily proselytizing, but as a people working in the world to do God's redemptive work. No matter how great you are, capable you are, we are all still part of God's succession. We have several negative examples who take this succession so lightly, and they fall into their own self-importance, and with enormous power, if they have, wielded to the destruction of the community and the nation. We have a great example of our most immediate previous president of the United States used great democratic institutions for the needs and self-gratification whims of his self-importance. And the majority of the country actually went with him and still going with him, as Senate just acquitted him of all the high crime of treason. But we also have great examples in our own churches. All those pastors, mega churches, great global ministries, uh, and they become so important. They become their own God, and almost invariably they fall into uh, sins and destructions, and usually transgressing the boundaries of sexual ethics and and moralities, because they didn't see their work and ministry or their service to the nation as part of this great succession of God's redemptive work. But they become self-important. So in this time of Lent, let us recognize that your life, my life, our life as congregation, our life as a nation even, our life as a human race on this generation, on this earth, occupying this earth, are all part of great and long successions of God, bringing healing and redemption to all God's creation. And you are not unimportant. You are actually very, very important. If you don't fulfill that link in succession, God has come up with plan Bs, and God has been doing lots of plan Bs in successions. So be affirmed how important you are in your limitation and abilities. But let us adopt that humility that we are only part of a larger reality that God is bringing about. Actually, when you and I come to worship and hear God's confirmation of how important we are as children of God, we are standing on this holy ground. Holy ground because we are the succession of what Jesus was doing to save all God's people in creation. In our Methodist hymnal, there is a beautiful song in the hymnal supplement number 272 called Holy Ground. I know many of you know the songs. So as I offer this meditation song, will you join me? We are standing on holy ground, and I know that there are angels all around. Let us praise Jesus now. We are standing in His presence on holy ground. We are standing on holy ground. And I know that there are angels all around. Let us praise Jesus now. We are standing in His presence on holy ground.